A year ago today, I switched from my trusty Canon 5D Mark III to the Canon R6. And one of the first things I did was to change some settings that I consider crucial before I can even start to think about shooting. So today I'm going to share with you the 10 settings that I personally change whenever I get my hands on a new camera, whether it's bought or borrowed, so that I have my camera set up exactly the way I want it. Hey there, I'm Audrey-Anne, founder of Live Snap Love, and I'm on a mission to help photographers just like you grow their photography skills quickly and in a way that feels simple and easy so you can shorten the learning curve and get photos you love faster. I created this Photography Made Simple podcast to share simple, actionable techniques, helpful insights, and practical advice on all things photography. So if you're itching to take your photos to the next level, whatever that level may be, you're in the perfect place. So let's get started. Well, hello there and welcome back to another episode of Photography Made Simple. Now, today's episode is a juicy one because there is a lot of information here, even though it's not a particularly long episode. I'm sharing with you the 10 settings I personally change whenever I get a new camera. Now, if you're more experienced and you have a new camera body or you're planning on getting one, you can consider this a checklist just to make sure that you remember everything. If you're newer to photography, you probably won't want to go and change all these settings immediately. You are going to need to know how to use each one first, but you can certainly consider these settings as things you might want to start to pay more attention to and then change as you go along. Before we dig into them, I do want to add a big disclaimer. There is no one way to set up your camera. This is just how I do it based on my personal shooting style and the type of photos I take, which is mainly lifestyle and portraiture. So these aren't magic settings. It's just the way I like to have my camera set up. If you want to have your camera set up differently, then of course that is absolutely fine. Now, I shoot Canon, so I'm using their terms here, but if you shoot Nikon or Sony, you'll find that the terms are very, very similar. But you might want to grab your camera manual if you're unsure about anything or how to change these. I always say that your camera manual is useless for learning photography, but it's absolutely crucial for knowing where everything is on your particular camera model. And finally, these aren't settings that are unique to my camera or any higher end camera for that matter. I would change to these functions on my Canon Rebel or if I used an entry-level Nikon. So these aren't settings that are unique to higher end models. These really are just the basics. Now, when I get a new camera, I tend to go through the menu in order. That way I'm being really logical with it. And so I don't inadvertently miss anything crucial out. So let's kick things off now with the first thing on my menu, which is image quality. So I always change image quality to RAW. Now this is because I want to have the full range of tones that are available in the image when I go to process it. That way I get the most control when editing my image. Plus, I don't want the camera to make editing decisions for me, which is exactly what it's going to do if I shoot in JPEG. I want to be able to edit the image exactly how I want it. So shooting in RAW overall gives me the power to get my images looking just right. The second setting that I change is white balance, and I move this away from auto white balance, and I will usually have this set to custom. That way I can set my own white balance each and every time I shoot using my Expo disc. Now I do this because I want to make sure that the colors are right in my image. And I don't like to use auto white balance because that can very often get it wrong, particularly when shooting indoors. I've found that auto white balance is pretty good in daylight outside, but when it's getting dusk, when you're in the shade, when you're indoors, it frequently tends to get it wrong. So that way I like to set my white balance myself, and I usually do that with the custom setting. If I don't have that with me for any reason, then I'll either use one of the presets or I'll use Kelvin. I very, very rarely, in fact, never now go and use auto white balance. The third setting that I go and change is my metering mode. Now, I always use spot metering, or at least I do 99% of the time. So this is another absolute must for me. Now, this means that my meter will show me the exposure level for a single area of the image that I select. Now, as I say, I usually photograph either portraiture or lifestyle. So for me, this is often the skin. But I do use this for other types of images as well. It's just ingrained into me now, so it doesn't really matter what I'm shooting. I use spot metering on my images. So again, that's another setting that I go in there and immediately change. If I don't have that, I kind of get confused about the whole thing. Now, I have to say at this point, some of these terms might be a little confusing for you if you're brand new to photography. If that's the case, then I do have a freebie for you, which is going to help you. It's my photography starter guide and kit. And you can go ahead and download that. It's going to show you everything you need to learn. It's got links to further reading. It's just going to give you a lot more understanding of what we're talking about here and give you a checklist of what you need to learn. So you'll find that at the show notes for this episode at livesnaplove.com/6. or around where you're listening to this episode. Okay, moving on now. We have already done the image quality set to raw. We've changed our white balance to custom, and I'm using spot metering mode. The next thing I'm going to do is set how I play back my images. So the next one is highlight alert. So I always turn on my highlight alert. This is often referred to as the blinkies. And this lets me see any areas of the image that are clipped when I'm setting my exposure, so that if it is too bright in certain areas, I can adjust my exposure before I start shooting away. Now, if you shoot Sony, this is one area where it is called something completely different. It's called either the zebra pattern or the zebra function. I can't remember exactly which one, but it's called zebra something, and it works in exactly the same way. It's just called a completely different name for some reason known only to Sony. But you'll find that usually listed as something like highlight alert or highlight tone alert or something like that, basically showing you when you have too bright highlights in your image. Now, the next thing I change is my image review. Although I don't look down at my screen after every shot, I do like to be able to quickly check my exposure. So I always have my image review turned on and I have it set to 4 seconds. That's usually enough time for me to assess the image, make sure that everything is the way I want it before I keep shooting. The next thing is my screen brightness. Now, I do take a few test shots before I do this, but I find that on most cameras, the screen brightness is just too high. And this can really throw me off my game when it comes to exposure. I did find that when I went to the R6, I forgot to change this initially, and all my images were coming out about a stop underexposed. And it's really just because my screen brightness was too high. I was looking at that just to kind of assess the overall exposure, and you know, it kind of threw me off my game a little bit. So I normally take this down a level. Then what I see on my screen more accurately reflects the true exposure. Now, I do also have it set so that I can see the histogram, so that should also give me a guide, but I do just like to be able to look at the image and get a rough guide to my exposure. So let's do a quick recap again. So as I said, we're covering a lot in this. So I've changed my image quality to raw, my white balance is set to custom, and my metering mode is set to spot. And as for playing my images or reviewing my images when I'm shooting, I've made sure I've turned on my highlight alert, my image review is turned on and set to 4 seconds, and I've turned down my screen brightness. Now, on that last one, I do want to say, don't just go and turn that down because I've said that I do it on mine. Check this. And if you find that you are frequently getting underexposed images, even by half a stop, turn down the screen brightness a little and see if that makes a difference. Remember, that won't actually fix the exposure in your image. It won't change anything. It's just changing how it's viewed on your camera after you've taken a shot. Okay, so the next few settings are all on focus. Did I just hear you sit up a little bit straighter in your chair? I think I did. So the first one that I change is actually into custom controls. because I like to use back button focus. So I always go into the custom menu and change the settings to customize my buttons. So I remove focus from the shutter button and assign that to the AF on button on the back of my camera instead. Now, one of the first episodes here on the podcast, episode 3, is actually all about back button focus. I talk about what it is, when you might want to use it, what type of images it's good for, and also how to set that up on your camera. So be sure to give that a listen if you want to know more about it. Again, I'll link to that in the show notes, or you can scroll back from where you're listening to this one, just a couple of episodes until you find episode 3 and give that one a listen after this one. Okay, moving on now to number 8, I change my AF method. So again, we're still sticking with focus here. I'll also set my AF method to 1.AF. Now, this allows me to choose the focus point instead of my camera. This is so important for getting sharp images. It's basically, step 1 in getting sharp focus. Because if you don't do this, the camera is going to pick the focus point for you. And that might not be exactly where you want it to be. Let's move on now to number 9, where I'm going to talk about the setting for the Servo AF. Now, remember at the beginning I said I would set my camera up in the same way for a Canon Rebel or any other entry-level camera. But this one is the only one that you won't have access to if you have an entry-level camera. So my camera has different case settings for focus. They have different ones depending on whether the subject is accelerating away from you or toward you or running in a straight line. But I tend to leave this on case 1, multi-versatile settings, and I leave it on that 99% of the time. If I want to at any point, I can definitely go in and change this to one of the different case settings. But this multi-purpose one actually does a grand job for most situations. So to be honest, I rarely deviate from that. I am quite lazy when it comes to changing settings if I don't need to. I probably should experiment with this a little bit more though, but it is something that I tend to always leave set on case 1, as I find that works well in a majority of situations, and I would go in and change it to something else if I specifically needed to do that. Now, I do have some other settings for focus that my camera has that you won't have on an entry level, such as orientation linked AF point or touch and drag AF point. To be honest, the jury's still out on those, so it's something I'm experimenting with, but they most definitely aren't crucial settings for me at the moment. I don't use them. I don't like the touch and drag AF point. My nose tends to set it off. It's maybe just the size of my nose. Maybe something that you need to get used to, but they aren't crucial settings for me. I've been shooting with the R6 for a year, getting tack sharp images without having to use any of these. Something that you might want to experiment with though if you have a camera similar to mine. Let's move on now to number 10, which is our final setting, and that is the drive mode. Now, this one maybe isn't as crucial as the others, but I always like to change my drive mode too. Now, by default, most cameras will be set up for single image shooting, which means every time you press the shutter button, it captures a single photo. Even if you kept your finger pressed down on the shutter button, it will still only record one solitary image. So I changed my drive mode to continuous. In this mode, your camera will continue to take photos for as long as you have your finger pressed down on that shutter release button, or at least it will until your buffer fills up. This is really useful for action shots when you might not be able to press the shutter at exactly the right moment. Having continuous mode on means you get a burst of shots. So let's say your child was jumping off a rock. As they start to jump, you just hold your finger down on the shutter button and it takes one image right after the other in a burst of shots. And then when you go back and look at that later, either in the back of your camera, but for me, this would be back in editing, I can delete the ones that don't show that perfect moment and just leave that one that has that perfect timing to it. And you wouldn't be able to get that with that single image shooting. So changing the drive mode, again, it's something that's particularly useful if you do any type of action shots, whether that be cars or bicycles or wildlife or your kid coming down a slide or on a bicycle or running towards you or whatever. Really useful to help you nail that perfect moment. So there you have it. Let me quickly recap over the 10 because as I said, although it's quite short, we covered a lot of information. So the first one was changing the image quality to RAW. That's going to help me by preserving the broadest range of image brightness. That means I can lift shadows and bring back highlights that I wouldn't be able to do if I was shooting in JPEG. It's also not going to apply any editing to the image like it would with a JPEG, and therefore I can edit the image exactly the way I want it. Number 2 is white balance. I have that set to custom so that I can make sure I have the most accurate color in my image. Number 3 is metering mode, and I always use that in spot metering, and that means I can get really accurate with my exposure much more quickly. I shoot in manual mode, so being able to get my exposure right quickly is pretty crucial. Number 4 was a highlight alert that lets you see any areas of the image that are clipped so that you can bring down exposure if you need to. Number 5 is image review because I want to be able to quickly review an image just by looking down at my camera when I take a shot. Don't do it all the time, but I do that for setting up my camera in the first place. And because I found I was underexposing a little bit all the time, I adjusted my screen brightness so that what I see on the screen more accurately reflects what I'm capturing. Number 7 was to set a back button focus. Don't forget, I have that episode, which is number 3, all about back button focus. Number 8 was changing my AF method to 1.AF so that I'm choosing exact position where I want my camera to focus. This is going to help it be a lot more accurate. And number 9 is this Servo AF multi-purpose setting. Now remember, you won't have this setting if you're using an entry-level camera, but if you have a more advanced camera, you should have something similar to this where you have different case studies for your focus. Again, I leave this set to the multi-versatile setting. I find it works really well in most situations. And the final one was a drive mode. So I changed this away from single image shooting and I set this up for continuous shooting. You often get two different options for this. Low continuous mode and high continuous mode. I tend to set it to low, but if I know I'm doing a lot of action shots, I might switch that to high. And having that can help you nail the perfect moment in your action shots. So we've reached the end of this episode, but I have a little homework for you to do because I want you to have a think about the settings that I've mentioned here. So if you're more experienced and you use something different and you know why you use it, then go ahead and continue with that. As I said in the beginning, my settings aren't magic settings. They're just what I use. You may find that something else works equally as well for you, and that is absolutely fine. But if you're starting out, then some of these settings might not mean a lot to you, or maybe you're still using the auto version of that setting. For example, you're having the camera choose a focus point, or you're using evaluative metering on your camera. That's matrix on an icon, by the way. Then just consider these 10 things, a list of things to start to learn about. I do recommend that you download that free photography starter kit and guide. It's going to go over a lot of these things for you, and it will give you a reference guide so you know exactly what you should be learning at any point. You can find that at the show notes for this episode or head to livesnaplove.com/blueprint to download it. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed creating it, and I'll see you next Tuesday for more photography wisdom. Bye for now. So that wraps up this week's episode of Photography Made Simple. I'll be back at the same time, same place next week. But if you want more, head on over to livesnaplove.com/podcast, where you can find all the resources and the downloads mentioned, plus a whole lot more. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you won't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week.